Okay, welcome back. I'm recording this on Wednesday night, the night that the paper is actually due, and this is at 5, or 5:30, just trying to get a quick lecture in to help you guys. The page structure lecture is after the value lecture. The page structure lecture is probably one of the ones that's most relevant to writing the paper. And then also out of Unit 7, the Visual Pathways lecture is also pretty helpful for writing the comparison paper as well. And so what I want to talk about in this lecture is about the way artists think about organizing a composition and how they think of, and in some cases, this is something that artists are doing kind of instinctually, and in other very cases, we know that they were thinking of doing this consciously, where they're thinking about the page, the rectangle that they're working in, as having a structure, right? Like every square, every rectangle has a corner to corner diagonal that defines where pure center is, and that pure center defines where the perfect vertical center is and where the perfect horizontal center is. And then that continues to divide up into more diagonals and more divisions, quads and eighths, and so on. And but also compositions can be divided up into thirds and other kinds of mathematical formulas. And when we start looking at artwork and looking at how they use the geometry of the page, we start to notice certain things. So in this page, we're looking at a bunch of Renaissance artwork. One of the things about the Renaissance was that triangular compositions were extremely popular in the Renaissance. And because for various reasons, they have a sense of automatic hierarchy. There's a top pinnacle point, and then you get to play with things in the lower part of the triangle, different kinds of diagonals, right? And you can make it perfectly symmetrical or slightly off from symmetrical. You can have the center of the triangle right in the center of the composition. So the Renaissance artists liked this because it was simple and basic and geometric, right? That it was as close to kind of Euclidean or perfect Platonic ideals of math, right? Triangle is the shape with the smallest number of sides possible, so it is in some ways kind of like close to perfect. And they liked it because also, I mean, it has kind of like an automatic reference to the Trinity. And I need to change pages here. Okay, so let's start. Let's go back. Let's start here. So the thing about the geometry of the page is that, and the reason why this is relevant for artists, whether they're thinking about this very explicitly, like actually we see their pre-planning drawings and we can see all their geometric diagrams, and those artists that are much more loose and much more kind of like expressive, intuitive, and gestural, still, for all artists working on a page that has a defined border, there are certain things that come up. And the reason is because we as human beings, we can always see these things, whether they're like actually spelled out or not, meaning we can see the diagonal from corner to corner and the diagonal from corner to corner, right? And we can see the vertical and horizontal um, axes that represent the midlines. We can see those, and that's why we can tell that that circle is off. And we know that it's really awkward and uncomfortable because it seems close to where it's supposed to be, but it's not quite. Now, I didn't change the position of this one, but I added a new one. And notice how now they seem much more consonant rather than dissonant, right? The single one, let's go back. The single one is awkward, the way it just sits there, so close to the spot it's supposed to be, but not in it. But now with two, they're balanced. And interestingly enough, this having this here even balances that a little bit, which is kind of fun. And so simply by just adding one more mark, we get to a new kind of like consonants, a new place where things feel like they sit in the right spot. And so there was a psychologist, a perceptual psychologist in the early 20th century, especially in the 20s, Rudolf Arnheim, who wrote a lot about this topic. And he came up with some theoretical models as to why this is. And basically, what he's saying is that anytime you look at a page, there's these kind of zones, right? These locations that are similar to these basic perfect geometries of where is the perfect diagonal corner to corner, where is the perfect vertical, perfect horizontal, right? Where is perfect center? And we have a sense of being close, but not quite, or being perfectly on. And so when we look at these diagrams with these circles on pages, we can tell when things are off and how much. And A, just like my first one, A is the most uncomfortable one because it's the one that doesn't have, like, E is on the corner to corner diagonal, C right on there, right? D is on the perfect vertical, and its division right there looks like it actually might be on the fourth as well. Okay. But A is kind of off from everything just a little bit. And that makes it more uncomfortable. So how does this apply to the artwork that we've already seen? So here are two works that we've seen from the last unit when we talked about the Renaissance. And I want to start with the Lamentation. So we have certain kind of geometric structures, right? We start with perfect center and the corner to corner diagonals. But Giotto does not totally rely on that. He relies also on this diagonal. And that diagonal goes from that mark right there, which is a third, and then this mark right there, which is a fourth. Um, and they're pretty close to perfect fourth there and perfect third there. So, but not like 100%. So that was coming to that balance of where this diagonal is was probably something he did intuitively rather than planning it mathematically. But nonetheless, look at all the things that kind of line up, right? Look at how, especially how it all kind of lines up. And it's really interesting because this saint is not the center of, or it's not the most important part of the composition. The most important part is this, but he places this here in the center, but then this figure becomes a directing line to this point, right? And the corner to corner diagonal does lead us here as well. And this diagonal also crosses there. So, like I said, the geometry here is a little bit more intuitive, but nonetheless, it is all kind of serving the point of bringing our attention like from there to there. Now, when we get to Bellini here, it becomes even more um, like thoroughly thought out. Because let me talk a little bit about what the point of this painting is, and then how the geometry relates to the point of the painting. So the point of the painting is that St. Francis has removed himself from his life of wealth and of power. He has given up his nobility. He's given up his wealth. He has ridden out this one lone donkey out to the wilderness, alone with his Bible and apparently with a skull for contemplation of death. And he's living in a cave as a hermit, and he is trying his best to kind of like connect with what is true, try to connect with the divine. Okay. And so he's standing here in this sort of moment of rapture. Like he's been studying intently, he's been praying intently, and he's coming out of the cave and he walks out to the cliff edge just to kind of like look out at the space. And all of a sudden he's like struck, right? He is with the spirit. But where is the representation of the spirit? If you remember from like Bernini's, go back, Bernini's sculpture of Saint Teresa in Ecstasy, right? There you have like an actual physical angel with an arrow in hand to represent the touch of the divine. But there's nothing here in this picture that represents the divine or the connection of the divine to him. And yet there is, because the geometry of the composition itself, the corner to corner diagonals, become, right? Like notice how this line right there, which is very close, parallel to the corner to corner diagonal, and that goes right through the center, right through his heart, right? And notice also how there are these little little plays, like he has an arc of the tree right there and an arc of that cloud right there, just to kind of like make sure we get the point of that that is where the divine is coming in and connecting with St. Francis. So in this particular painting, that geometric organization is part of the point, part of the theme, part of the narrative of the painting. Okay, here's another image. So, and in order for me to explain how the geometry, do I have a diagram? I do. I have a diagrammatic version of it. So in this, to understand like what the geometry is doing here, we also have to understand what the meaning of this painting is. So this is a story from the founding of Rome, and um, it's a story. Basically, it was common in the ancient world for ancient peoples to have kind of founding sins, right? Like these awful things that they did, they had to do that helped them become who they are, right? So Rome has that in like a very mythic sense with Romulus and Remus, right? And this, the kind of like the twin sacrifice sort of idea, but it comes up again in the history of Rome with the rivalry between Rome and this other Latin group called the Sabina. And so in this narrative, the Romans trick the Sabine warriors. They say like, "Come out here, and we're going to fight you in an all-out battle." And then when they gather up their army and out they go to whatever the location was where the two armies were going to meet, the Roman army does the opposite. They head straight to the main city of Sabina and they sack it, right? Killing all the women, all the old men, all the children, right? It's an act of treachery, of betrayal, and it's violent and horrific, right? Like this is like the name of the painting, we now call it the abduction of the Sabine women, but the older term was the rape of the Sabine women. And it is kind of like that's what the story is about. It is horrific. It's awful. But then here's the interesting thing. All this horrific stuff is happening. The painting is about all this horrific stuff. And yet, when you look at this painting, it's quiet and still, right? And so the question is, why is it so quiet and still? I mean, like, yeah, each gesture, each person reaching out, they kind of feel a little bit like there's a little bit of energy there, and yet at the same time, they're paused. Everyone is like frozen, right? And part of the reason why they're frozen is the way that Poussin painted, which was a very very kind of tight and very kind of sculpture-esque way he painted, like extra modeling every form, quite different from Rubens, who is much more loose and gestural. But another reason why everything is kind of like really kind of frozen is that everything is very tightly locked into the geometry of the page, right? And Poussin is one of those artists that we know studied math and geometry and applied it to his paintings and considered things like, you know, the golden mean, the golden rectangle, and use that. In fact, most of his horizontal rectangular compositions are golden rectangles. And so he was very much interested in studying the math of how these things were put together. And so he was and so you can kind of see how all of this, because all these major things, like the way this triangle of figures kind of lines up with the diagonal, or the way this group of figures kind of lines up slightly off, but kind of at least references that main diagonal, and how things line up with the main horizontal. How all of that leads to everything having this kind of like locked in and kind of perfectly in place kind of moment. If we go back for a second to this page, the thing about that and the awkwardness of that position of like that dot being there and it's not quite right is that both feels awkward, but it also feels like potential movement. It feels active, kind of annoyingly active, but it feels active. And when things are locked in, right, they feel static. They feel like still. Okay. And so that's what's going on here with the abduction of the Sabine women. Here with Watteau, we have a similar kind of thinking about geometry, but much looser. He's kind of like, he's languorously reminding us of it and alluding to it, but also just kind of playing off of it. He's not being particularly tight with the geometry, and I will show you what I mean by that. So here's the basic geometry of the structure, the corner diagonals, right? And you can see that things do line up to a degree, but the main line of everything kind of like meanders up to the diagonal, then meanders off of it, and meanders up to this vertical a little bit, but then meanders off of it. And everything about the way he organizes this is about kind of like saying, I know where I am, I know what I'm doing, I know where the forces are in this painting, where the geometry is, but I'm playing with it. Rolling with it. Here's a different kind of use of geometry. Titian had a very different way of thinking about how to organize like lots of different paintings. He tended to be much more like inventive with like just coming up with novel ways of organizing compositions. And so here, everything here is kind of like almost like the moving of time, like arms of a clock, but it's also kind of like a bow, right? And it's like Bacchus is being shot at to Ariadne, like that he's going right for her. He's the arrow in the metaphor. All right, here's another painting where we can see how the geometry works. In the earlier lecture on value, I mentioned how even though this character here, that's Matthew, this is the character that we are drawn our attention to first, which I think is really interesting. I'm not entirely sure why Caravaggio did it. Maybe to a degree because he wants us to also be a little bit surprised. Like we first think, oh, Jesus is calling this guy. This guy's rich. This guy's got, he's fancy. He's good looking. And then we have from this character, we're led to Matthew, and then we're like, oh no, it's that guy. Maybe that's the reason. Um, but notice how the organization of the page, it leads us to this moment where this character is and where the character of Matthew are, along with the diagonals cast by the light are also leading us to that point. Okay. All right. So here's an issue, right? Like this is the painting that you have to write the paper about. And in order to discuss this, I need to talk a little bit about general some of the things that happen in Baroque composition. This is not always the case, but remember how I said in Renaissance composition there was they very much enjoyed triangular compositions, and many artists also really enjoy compositions that use one diagonal corner to corner or another diagonal corner to corner. But by the time we get to the Baroque, there was a new kind of solution, which was to rely on one diagonal here, but the other diagonal is not really used much at all. Instead, you focus on the diagonals that go from the corner perpendicular to the main diagonal, right? And from the corner perpendicular to the main diagonal. And as you can see, especially on the top side, he's very much using that. On this side, not so much, right? I mean, we do have this on that line, but there's a little bit of a gap before we get to the women who are supporting at the bottom of Jesus. But and then take a look at this. This is very clever about the way Rubens was composing. If I can get this bar to go back up, come on. Which was that it's not only using that same device in the center, but then he's also thinking about it as the full triptych. And look how it's all kind of organized on this main diagonal right there. And how that cuts through some important parts, especially in the center here. And then when we think about these diagonals here, right, that go and also make it perpendicular to the main diagonal line. So there you go. I can't get that to go away. Go away. Okay, so if you hear moaning in the background, that's my dog, Max. He's complaining. Just about everything, really. And so, Raft and Medusa. We've talked about the Raft and Medusa multiple times. I will be talking about it again later on when we have the lecture on art and power. I'll tell the full story of the history of it and the narrative that's being told in the painting. But for right now, I just want you to see it in terms of how it's organized as a page structure. That is Max, if you can hear him. So remember earlier I'd said that Renaissance compositions are organized around triangles, and generally the triangles were centered or close to center, and they're usually a single triangle. In the Romantic era, they kind of revived this idea of triangular compositions, but they were much more interested in offset triangles, triangles that kind of leaned and were centered, like not in the center, but like had a center line off from the center. And a lot of times they also liked triangles that were like double triangles, one that balanced in one direction and one that leaned in the other direction. And that's exactly what we have here with Géricault's painting Raft the Medusa, because, right, and it really kind of gets this, the main triangle is this one where all the figures are leaning towards, right? All their movements are pushing into that triangle and making that movement, right? But then this triangle, which is much more kind of defined by the raft itself and the mast and the sail, is the counterbalance to that really sharp, heavy movement of the triangle that's made up of all the figures. Okay, and there it is without all the diagrams. Here's some more ways to think about it, including, I don't know if any of you are fans of Tintin, but I like that image from Tintin, remembering the raft of the Medusa. Here's another example of a romantic use of a triangular composition. So Delacroix is leaning not quite as much, but still using a kind of a leaning off-centered triangle as the primary means of creating movement. Notice that he is thinking about these diagonals here as creating counterbalance to that main triangle and how that leads. This is another painting that we'll talk about more in depth in terms of its content meaning and the art and power lecture. But for right now, I just want you to kind of notice how it's composed, how it's organized. All right. So far we've been talking about ways that compositions are using geometry, but by the time we get to like close to the 20th century, artists are starting to think about things like how to create dissonance in their compositions. I wish I could get this bar to go away. Not going to happen. There we go. Okay, don't know what I did. So in this composition, you can see that there's both a balanced use of geometry, right? But at the same time, there's a lot of thought about things coming up close to the lines of the geometry and kind of playing off of it and kind of creating these little moments of awkwardness and tension. And then when we look at something like this, right, Francis Bacon was all about trying to like everything he did was about tension. Like the way he painted, he really loved to kind of like pair really, really dry, flat passages that were large, flat, dry passages, then with other passages that were more kind of built up and gushy, but still kind of annoyingly dry. He loved to make decisions that were frustrating and tense and awkward. Um, but also in composition, he liked to kind of play off of locations and place things in certain ways that felt slightly awkward, slightly tense. Like I love the placement of this dog right there, where it just kind of is like it's both on the center, but it's really kind of like kind of arcing above and around the center and just feels so incredibly dissonant, and it's really nice. And here's another example we talked about this painting earlier when we talked about complementary color organization, but I wanted you to see how even a painting like this that is as loose and as gestural and spontaneous as this, that seems almost chaotic, when you really start putting in lines, figuring out where the movements are and how they relate to the geometry of the page, you start to notice that it's actually a lot more organized and thought out than you thought. And I think this is my last image. This is Annie Leibovitz photo spread. And yeah, you can tell that she very definitely thought about how to organize the whole page spread, and have the geometry just kind of line up everywhere. Okay. And that is the end of the lecture. Um, and I will probably do at least another lecture on maybe I might jump to Unit 7 and do the lecture on visual pathways sometime tomorrow just to help people out. And then I'll get started on kind of finishing Unit 6. Okay, thank you.